let's get into this opinion piece first off and go from there, because this is a big one. A CBDC dollar would empower the Fed, not Americans. Anyone who believes in limited government should not support a central bank digital dollar. That is the subtitle. And, you know, we've been preaching this for a while, so it's kind of funny to see this coming out of the Wall Street Journal. Of course, we'll have to see how they approach it and what they specifically state here. Now, this is an opinion piece, but my opinion aligns with basically the premise here that if you do believe in limited government, you shouldn't support a central bank digital dollar. But I think it goes a lot deeper than that, especially as we start to see what the current CBDC implementations in China are and what is being adopted in the UK. So when we look at China, one of the things that's really come to fruition that is alarming, to say the least, is the push for an expiration date on the cryptocurrency itself, meaning, and this is on the CBDC, specifically the digital yuan. What this pushes people into, of course, is a position of inability to work themselves or save themselves out of their current economic situation. You see, in the past, the way you as an individual set yourself up to take care of yourself in your older age, to pass down wealth to your children, your grandchildren, to future generations in your family line, is to save, right? And what this allows people to do is to break out of whatever economic situation they may be in and break into a higher income bracket. This allows you to also have some security. And without that, what you end up having, essentially, if you don't have the ability to save, what that ends up doing is not allowing people to move up economically, especially generation over generation, right? Typically, like, building that generational wealth usually has some sort of component of being able to hold any sort of currency or assets that you own. But if you're in the position where you work and then you get paid and you have to spend that money within a specific timeline, or it no longer exists, then you are forced to essentially work nonstop for the rest of your life, and you will have nothing to pass down to your children. There are ways that will be utilized to get around this, of course, like purchasing assets. And I think that all in all, that is like a pretty clear path out, which is purchasing assets. But what happens when those assets are difficult to move, right? If you have cash, it's a little bit easier because it's lightweight. If you have a digital access to your accounts via a bank that's going to provide that for you later, makes it a little bit easier. But the end game here really for passing down wealth to future generations, in my humble opinion, does appear to be leaning towards cryptocurrency. And that is because if you have to do something with the money, you might as well put it into an asset that's easily movable, not only between individuals, but also between borders, right? And it's going to be a lot easier to move a cryptocurrency throughout, across borders than it is to move, well, even fiat currency. But in the case that it's expiring, well, what's the point in that? So this is really kind of setting us up here for an interesting conversation where it's like the movements of the current economic status into what is commonly referred to as modern monetary theory, which is going to be essentially just a non-stop generation of currency and basically trying to spur on the purchase of consumer goods, which is what they're trying to do. And if we're going to be able to combat that, right? And I think that this is going to be a really interesting time to live through. And let's get into this opinion piece a little bit further. It says a growing number of Democrat and Republican policymakers support creating a central bank digital currency, or CBDC, that would further empower the Federal Reserve. Although the parties disagree on the particulars, their broad agreement on the idea creates a political opening for the Fed and the Biden administration to move ahead with the CBDC that will compromise, Americans' freedoms. Some lawmakers say a CBDC, which is a digital dollar issued by the Fed, could help stave off a debt crisis and preserve the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. This is extremely important because a digital currency in and of itself would not stave this off. The manner in which it is deployed and managed is what would stave it off. So you can already start to see through the facade, at least pretty quickly, when you look at how, like I said, it's being implemented already on the digital yuan, and how the UK is going to be copying this modern monetary policy, that the real goal here is to spur on the spending of Americans on consumer goods, consumer products. It's always been this way, right? Like, to a certain extent, we are just like building on top of it. It's a house of cards, right? It will collapse at some point. And the entire goal is to try to get it to essentially continue on for as long as possible. And if you are in a position where the US dollar is essentially compromised by individuals holding that US dollar or having some sort of power over that by not spending it, then you are not stimulating the economy. And so it wouldn't be completely out of the realm of possibilities that a CBDC in the United States would adopt similar policies here, especially if you read this statement. But that will be seen later on. Not everyone is persuaded that such a currency is a good idea. Neil Kashkari, the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, questioned why Americans would support a CBDC, saying, quote, "If they want to monitor everyone for your of your transactions, you can do that with a central bank digital currency," end quote. He said at a conference last year, continuing, "I get why China would be interested. Why would the American people be for that?" is what he goes on to say. Early Democratic support was concentrated among progressives such as Senator Elizabeth Warren, who obviously Democrat of Massachusetts, coming from Massachusetts, and Fed Vice Chair Lael Brainerd. But the sweeping scope of President Biden's CBDC executive order in March signals broad acceptance within his party. By mobilizing government agencies and departments to prepare for a CBDC, Mr. Biden made clear that his administration is ready to take up this newfound power when the opportunity presents itself. For Democrats, the party of big government, the appeal is obvious. A CBDC would allow the federal government to spend more money, manage outcomes, and provide financial services to the unbanked. And this is an important part too, because when we start to discuss the unbanked, what we're really talking about here is the people that are basically in need of government assistance. And if you have a population that is in need of government assistance, right, and you can control that assistance through a digital platform, starting off, of course, with the implementation of free cell phones for people that are homeless or underprivileged, that sort of thing, which has already been implemented. And then it comes installed, with an app that accesses your Medicaid, your unemployment, anything along those lines, right? Any sort of government service means that your adoption rate goes through the roof, especially when the economy is poor, right? So if you have an economy that is struggling. You have more and more people dependent on the government for sustenance, right? For their day-to-day just ability to live and eat and function within society. Then you have an automatic adoption rate right there. Furthermore, when people say that the adoption rate wouldn't be that high in the United States, you have to also consider the fact that what we saw with, in particular, the disbursements for the pandemic relief stuff all went through basically a digital dispersion through your bank account that was already clearly, as they exposed, something that they already had access to. And this means that the only thing that's really standing between the government, the Federal Reserve here in this case, and direct control over the individual does become the banking system, which actually ends up being extremely interesting as we start to watch this new digital economy play out, right? Because what we're at right now, the crossroad is essentially a crossroad into the new digital finance, right? That's what's happening. And whoever can control that will obviously have an extreme amount of power. And that's important to pay attention to. But the thing is too, here's where I was going with that. If you are even middle class, let's say, here's the deal. If you are just in general an employee of any company, then typically you have taxes being held out of your check. And the only way you can access any of those taxes that are held out of your check at the end of the year, if you are in a financially compromised position, is to do what? File a tax return, right? So to do that, if they implement basically a CBDC allotment or disbursement of tax returns, you basically increase your adoption rate for a CBDC, exponentially. Because at that point, you have to realize that a majority of the population is in this situation where they put too much in, they pay too many taxes. And then when it gets to the end of the year, the government pays them back, right? They give back whatever extra that they took. And it's been a whole scheme from the very get-go because it's an incredibly effective business model, right? Because what is happening is a majority of Americans are overpaying throughout the entire year, and you can take and make that money that's being paid and make investments and whatever else on that, and then not have to pay it back till the end of the year. It's a win-win. Like, this is where you end up in a position where when people tell me that this wouldn't happen, a CBDC wouldn't be adopted by Americans, I'm like, it basically is already implemented, at least like these potentially damaging parts to individuals' finances. And if people want to actually get that back, they're going to adopt this. It's kind of a duh moment, right? Like, a CBDC will be quickly adopted by middle and lower class, by the working class in general. And that's just the fact of the matter. The centralization of power that a CBDC would allow runs counter to the Republican Party's intent to disperse power and shrink government. So it's startling to see the GOP policymakers entertain the idea. And, we could go into, at least from the United States perspective, of, well, you know what, like, sure, but we're pretty aware that it's turned into a uniparty at this point, right? The Republican, if it's a uniparty, if it comes down to, and when it comes down to the thing that matters, which is really at the end of the day, money, right? Like, if we're going to be completely honest about the entire ruse here, is like, everything else that aligns politically, like down a party line, is purely at this point a distraction away from big banks, the Federal Reserve, and everything that's going on there. If you start to look at when the real kind of separation of party lines and this radicalization of the two parties on topics ranging from abortion to LGBT to whatever else, you'll notice that all started kind of right after that push for Occupy Wall Street, right? Which was like the 99% versus the 1%, which is really 99.9% versus the 0.1%, if we're being completely honest about everything. And I would posture that a majority of these issues that are placed in front of our eyes on a day-to-day basis are just distractions to stop us from paying attention to what is really going on. And as we move closer and closer to the digital finance revolution, it's becoming more and more apparent, which is a good thing, but it is only going to be a good thing if people actually decide to start opting out. There is a push comes to shove that I think happens no matter what, personally. So in 2021, French Hill, Republican of Arkansas, and Jim Himes, Democrat, Connecticut, co-sponsored legislation encouraging the Fed to keep researching a CBDC. In November, Paul Ryan, the former GOP Speaker of the House, and Kevin Warsh, the former Fed Vice Chair, endorsed a CBDC in a book for the American Enterprise Institute. Some Republican proponents of a digital dollar say their party's version of a CBDC would enhance liberty, not government control. They favor a two-tier system using a CBDC exclusively between the Federal Reserve and providers of financial services. Now, what does this actually mean?
Established in 2017, Octominer is an international mining hardware company. They manufacture and engineer the best mining equipment in the industry and supply rigs to some of the largest mining farms around the world. Their GPU mining rigs also integrate with the top crypto operating systems like HiveOS, MinerStat, and Simple Mining. All parts come with an international 1-year warranty. Exciting news! They will be adding ASIC miners for sale to their website soon and launching a new product built specifically for ASIC home miners. Please visit octominer.com or email support@octominer.com for questions.
This is the line that the Republicans will use, and this is the front line of the actual battle that's going to take place before the individual is encompassed into this battle, right? So if we say, for example, that what we are going to see is something along the lines of what the sovereign individual predicted in that book, which I highly recommend you check out if you have not yet, then you would say eventually, due to the digital revolution, especially once finance is involved, the individuals will have autonomy and have financial freedom, and this will start to dissolve nation states. But before that could even happen, there has to be another battle that takes place. And whether we get past this battle ever is yet to be seen, obviously, but this battle will be between not the individual and the nation states, but the banks and the nation states. And what you're seeing here is that getting set up right now. Both parties are for essentially some sort of digital dollar, but one is supporting the banks. And that's probably coming from, of course, lobbyists and so on within the banks. So when you hear the Republican version of a CBDC versus the Democrat version of the CBDC, just know that that is banks versus the federal government. Just understand that that's what that is actually alluding to. And don't get mixed up on like, the Republicans are really fighting for the individual here, because that's not what's happening. They are just the banks in this situation, right? That is what they are. So moving on from there, by having private enterprise serve as a buffer between the Fed and the American people, Mr. Ryan argues that the centralizing power of the CBDC won't be merely muted, but inverted. And this is what I've said before too, is like, you are in this battle as an individual, right? In this competition between banks and basically an intermediary between banks and the Federal Reserve, and the banks still dispersing out to the individual, that would be status quo, meaning that that is more decentralized. So fundamentally, you would want to be on the side of the banks in this scenario. 48 laws of power, for example. You sit back, you don't throw in full support to either side, and you let the sides fight it out, so that when it comes to the fight that you need to have as an individual or as a collective of individuals versus kind of the system, hopefully they have weakened themselves, meaning the enemy is, yes, banking as well as the federal government here, as far as I should say, the enemy of decentralization are banks and federal government, but you kind of want to sit back and let them duke it out so that they're weaker later on down the line. This is just a fun kind of idea that I've been getting from 48 Laws of Power, and when we look at it from that stage. So who am I rooting for here? Well, I'm going to root for, of course, the banks in this sort of battle. That being said, sit back and let them duke it out. I don't need to go jump in on any of this, right? We're not going to be throwing on masks and heading down to Occupy Wall Street anymore. We'll let the banks and the federal government, Federal Reserve fight over this, right? By having private enterprise serve as a buffer between the Fed and the American people, he argues that centralizing power won't be merely muted but inverted. He says, we can show the world how a free society should handle this challenge by having a two-tier system, which guarantees the government has no role in the management of our money, Mr. Ryan said in an interview promoting the book. But once again, I say, this is status quo. This is how it functions as it is. So basically, as everything between these two parties typically plays out, the Republicans are fighting for status quo and the Democrats are fighting for the progressive modern monetary policy. That is really what you're seeing here, right? And it's in the name, right? You say Republicans, you think conservatives, and so on, right? You say Democrats, you think progressives. It's right there in the name. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out which side these parties would jump onto, right? So moving on from there, the vision ignores the fact that financial intermediaries can't protect their users' data from the federal government. Just last month, it was revealed that the Secret Service, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have been engaged in an almost decade-long warrantless financial surveillance of Americans who send or receive money through private operators such as Western Union and MoneyGram. It's naive to think that a government that is currently combing through individual financial information will stop doing so when it has the formidable power of a CBDC. Obviously, what does a CBDC do even in the status quo, right? So even if, let's say we go with Plan B, which is a two-tier system. Plan A we'll just refer to, well, let's say, yeah, I kind of wanted to save Plan B for Bitcoin, but and maybe for a pre-recorded video, we'll set this all up and have it lined out, and I'll get all my fun talking points here. But let's just say we go with a two-tier system here. All a CBDC does is make everything it just makes everything that's being done in the current status quo that much easier, right? The invasion of privacy, it makes it easier. Tracking what you do, it makes it easier. Like, it doesn't make it any more difficult, right? So you are still going in the direction of centralization regardless of what anybody wants to tell you there. In addition, Congress has proved itself incapable of auditing the Fed or holding it to account. unlike the intelligence agencies, the central bank was designed to be unaccountable. The Fed is a semi-private bank supervised by 7 governors serving 14-year terms. Its budget isn't appropriated by Congress, granting this already unaccountable institution more authority over our money would further empower the Fed's 20,000 plus employees, not the American people. Republicans backing a CBDC failed to recognize that making dollar transactions more efficient won't magically preserve the greenback's reserve currency status or keep the federal debt from growing. Maintaining the dollar's global position will require the Fed to manage the way dollars are used. Once again, I'm going to go back to this and you guys need to pay attention to it. Understand, this isn't crazy tinfoil hat anymore. The digital yuan is moving into having an expiration date. In the proposal in the UK for their digital currency, they are also saying that they will basically implement an expiration date. The importance, the way you stimulate the economy here is putting an expiration date on the currency that you pay out to the people so that they are forced to spend it. And this just basically builds up the house of cards a little bit taller, right? It means that you can continue this ruse just a little bit longer. It just means that everything that's been going on can be done a little bit more. This is why what you will see in general, of course, is a complete shift in the monetary policy, especially from the Democratic Party. The idea here, of course, is we're already talking about removing the debt ceiling. Why would you need to remove the debt ceiling? Because you need to basically accumulate a ton of debt, disperse it out, and then start burning it, right? What we're seeing here is literally what we see with coins that are getting in trouble for doing the same thing, because you now have a burn mechanism. You have an expiration of the token, but whose cryptocurrency in these cases, or of course digital currencies in these cases, is being burned? The actual people, not the people that run the entire system, right? It's like if you get into Hex or SafeMoon, like every time you purchase some, it's burning some of what you purchased, thereby just increasing the value for the people that are holding it or already holding it or are already whales within that. But the little guy that's just getting into it is the one that's getting burned here. He's the one who's losing the currency. This policy will basically implement that burn mechanism. So step 1, remove debt ceiling. Step 2, deploy the CBDC, disperse out to the people, apply some sort of mechanism that burns it after a certain amount of expiration, and then bing, bang, boom, you got yourself a nice little national level, Federal Reserve level Ponzi scheme going on. Policymakers in Washington have a choice between preserving a bloated federal government or putting America back on the path to limited government by uniting to stop a CBDC. One second, guys. There we go. Sorry. Excuse me. Had a call coming in I had to address real quick. So by uniting to stop a CBDC, Republicans can take the side of the American people. But if the GOP fractures on this issue, the Biden administration is ready to push through a CBDC and give the government even more power over Americans' money and lives. Mr. Feeler is president and chief investment officer of Equinox Partners and chairman of the American Principles Project. This is posted by Wall Street Journal. It is an opinion piece, but it is an opinion piece coming from typically what would be a publication that would align with the Democrats, usually, right? So when we read this, we need to take into account that this does mean that there's a lot here that is warranted as far as concerns. So I wanted to go over this one with you guys. I want to hear your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below. Thanks for checking out this clip from the Crypto Mining Show. You can check out the full episode here or more crypto content down here. Also, I'd like you to check out my locals page at sonofatech.locals.com, where you can become a member for free or choose to be a $5 a month supporter that unlocks additional content.